As we're following Israel's journey through the book of Exodus, we come to chapter 19. This is an important division in the book, and it's when they first arrive at Mount Sinai. Now, remember, 40-some years earlier, Moses is at this same mountain and he sees a burning bush. Now, that bush is not like a little shrubbery, it's a tree, and it's actually called the Sinai tree. And so that's what some commentators will say. That's why Mount Sinai is called Mount Sinai, to associate it with the Sinai tree that Moses saw on fire. Because when they come around the corner, and maybe Moses is expecting to see the tree on fire, because the Lord said, "Come here and I'll meet with the people," the tree's not on fire, the whole mountain is on fire. And so the experience that Moses has in chapter 3, then the entire people get to have in chapter 19, where they're all, in a sense, before not a burning Sinai tree, but they're standing before the burning Mount Sinai. Incredible. And so this is the moment where the book shifts from rescue to covenant. God has rescued the people, He purchased them, He made them His own, He redeemed them, and now He's going to give them His covenant. He's going to give them the law. He is, if you will, He's made them the people of God. Now He's going to show them how to live as the people of God. Or like we concluded in the last section, He's saved them out of Egypt, but He needs to save Egypt out of them. They're saved externally, but internally they're not yet rescued. So how is God going to do this? Well, He gives them a book. And it's the same for us. When God delivers and rescues us to get us out of our slavish ways of thinking, He gives us also the same book to transform our minds. And so the overarching purpose of the law is to do that, to show them how to live as the people of God. Now the question is why? What's the purpose? What's the goal they're going after? In Exodus 19, 5 and 6, actually from verse 4 all the way to 6 is another way that you can summarize the entire story. Because in verse 4 it talks about how He brought them out of Egypt, and then from verse 5 and 6 it talks about why He brought them out of Egypt and now what they're going to do. And I want you to observe the list of the key descriptions that God gives to His people. Starting at the end of verse 5. The first thing, He calls them His treasured possession. The second thing, He calls them a kingdom of priests. And then lastly, also in verse 6, a holy nation. So make sure you observe that list. This is God's description of His people. Now, they've come out to meet Him, and this is what He says of them. You are my treasured possession, kingdom of priests, holy nation. Let's go through those a little bit. Treasured possession, that makes sense. They're God's chosen people. He loves them. He's rescued them. They're the people He committed Himself to all the way back, beginning with Abraham. He loves these people. Holy nation, the word holy, it means set apart, meaning I've set you apart from the other nations. I've made you different than the Egyptian people. How about kingdom of priests? This is very important and very interesting. Now, the job of a priest was to act as a mediator between God and man. And in Israel, you had a whole tribe, the Levites, that were meant to act as these priests. And you had one who was the high priest. And that high priest was the mediator, the representative of God to the people and the people to God. And that was within Israel. You had one man that was the priest. But according to this passage, God says, collectively, as a nation, you're a nation of priests. Now, what could that mean? Who are they mediating between? Who are they representing God to? Well, if they're an entire nation as a priest, the only other option for them to represent God to is to the nations, to the surrounding nations around them. God has a specific relationship with them, and then they, through that relationship, represent Yahweh to the nations. It's the same as we looked at in our Bible overview with Adam in the garden, right? He was meant to be the image of God, to dwell with God, but also reign over the earth. He was a combination of a king and a priest. And now God's saying to the nation of Israel, you are a nation of kingdom, or you're a nation of priests, meant to represent me to the ones around you. And so God hasn't really saved, one way to view it is God hasn't really saved Israel from the nations. He saved Israel for the nations. He hasn't saved really Israel from Egypt, but rather for Egypt. They have now an example of what it means to be in right relationship with the God of the world. This passage, interestingly enough, you can find it in 1 Peter chapter 2, where Peter writes the same description of the church. And so if we approach it in that sense, it means that God hasn't really saved you from the world, but he saved you for the world, to have this relationship and responsibility to represent him. Let's see how that goes, because how is Israel going to do this, right? We saw at the beginning, the shepherds in the wilderness thought Moses was an Egyptian. How are they going to live differently? How will the nations look at them and know that they're different than they are? And that's one of the core purposes of the law, to make them look different. We talked about this at the beginning when we're trying to cross this historical gap back to the Old Testament. All of these, not all, but many of these laws seem rather ridiculous and unapplicable to our lives. We looked at the one of the altar of stone, right? You can't make an altar of cut stones in 20 verse 25. You have to use round stones. And another strange passage we looked at, in 23 verse 19, it says, "You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk." Now these were all ways of living and worshiping that the nations of the Canaanite people did. Their altars were square altars. One of their practices was boiling baby goats in the mother's milk as an offering to their pagan gods. Now, if Israel does the same thing they do, then the nations around them can either come to one or two conclusions. Either they'll say they're worshiping our gods because their altars, their offerings, their practices look like the ones to our gods. And so they're worshiping Baal or any other god of the Canaanite religion. Or, which is also as damaging, which we'll look at in the Ten Commandments, they'll say they're worshiping their God, but like our God. Meaning that their God is somewhat like our God, meaning they might be equal in power, equal in authority, equal in their dealings and relationships with human beings. So when the Canaanites would offer sacrifices, it wasn't out of worship, it was with the aim to manipulate the gods to give them what they want. And so if Israel worships like the gods of Canaan, then they're saying that our God also can be manipulated just like your gods. And so it tampers and it dilutes the message that they're meant to bring to the nations. And we can see this in a passage in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 4, verse 6, God tells them that if they keep the law, right, the effect it will have on the nations around them. Notice down in verse 7 and 8. "For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us, whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this law that I set before you today?" Meaning, as you follow this law, as your farming looks different, as your sacrifices look different, as your families look different, as your clothing looks different, the nations will say, "Who is this God that's so near to them? Who is the Lord?" Again, Pharaoh's question, who is the Lord? People don't really know, and Israel's job is to dwell with God and represent him. And so this law is meant to not only save Israel kind of internally and get them to think like sons and live like sons instead of slaves, but it also makes their witness all the more clear as they display the goodness and righteousness and justice of God. And so as we proceed into the law, we need to have these two things in mind. Now, one of the reasons they thought Moses didn't write this book is because there's no, they were saying people didn't write covenants like this at the time. People didn't write laws down like this. And so it had to have been much later by someone else. Well, as archaeology continued to unearth new things, they realized that there's loads of treaties like this, covenants like this from that time and even before Moses. And so at that time in the ancient Near East, you had two types of covenants. Now, a covenant is an agreement. We see this is called covenant in chapter 4. It's called the Book of the Covenant. And there was two options. One, you could have an agreement between two equal groups. Okay? An equivalent today would be like me making some kind of agreement with my neighbor, right? We're equal in authority, equal in power, equal in responsibility. There's a whole other type of covenant or treaty, and that was between a king and a conquered people. Now, I know it's not a very good comparison, but if one treaty is like a neighbor to a neighbor, this might be an agreement you make with your boss, right? He has more authority than you, more power. You're not enslaved to him, but that's about a good modern-day analogy, maybe. And so these treaties have a set structure. They typically start with a historical prologue where normally it's propaganda saying how this king is so great and how he's conquered you and delivered you and saved you. And then it goes into, because he's saved you and because he's rescued you, these are the laws, right? And there's kind of general laws, and then they're broken down into more specific laws. Then it continues, if you obey these laws of this king that has conquered you, there will be a blessing for obedience, and there will be a curse for disobedience. And then there's a few other minor parts of these covenants. We can see in the book of Exodus the exact same pattern in two sets. One, take a look at Exodus 19, Exodus 19, 3 until 6. You have all of these elements of an ancient Near Eastern covenant between a conquering king and the people that he has supposedly saved, right? In verse 3, it has the author of the covenant, right? Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, the words of the Lord, from earlier on in verse 3. That's typical at the start of any covenant. And then verse 4 is the historical prologue, right? How I rescued you, how I saved you. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Okay? That's what I've done for you. And then the laws come, right? Now, therefore, these are the laws. You have to obey my voice and keep my covenant. Okay? And then if they do obey those laws, the blessings are, you'll be my treasured possession, my kingdom of priests, my holy nation. And now we see the same thing happen in chapter 20. It's a similar structure, and actually the entire book of Deuteronomy follows this structure. Now, the major difference, right, is that God hasn't conquered his people. It's not propaganda. God has conquered the Egyptian people, and he did literally liberate his people. And also the other ancient Near Eastern covenants, those were all made to be in favor of the conquering king, right? You had to pay your taxes, and you couldn't speak bad about the king, and you couldn't rebel against the king, and it was all in the king's interest, and you were really treated like a slave. Whereas the covenant God makes with his people is an agreement between a father and a son, saying that these really are for your blessings. I mean, you take a quick look at the Ten Commandments. A nation that lives according to those principles will be blessed. There will be peace. There will be justice. There won't be injustice. There won't be slavery. And so you can see that these laws are actually in the interest of God's people. Now, as we go through it, there's three kinds of laws that you can observe. Okay, two of these aren't really renewed in the new covenant that we have with God, and one of them continues to be more relevant and easily applicable. So the first two are the civil and the ritual laws. Okay, so the civil laws are given to Israel because they're not just a group of people; they have a government, which today the church is not a government, and so we have to approach those differently. Then there's the ritual laws, and these are designed for people before Christ. This is how you approach God before Jesus comes in. And then the last ones are the ethical laws, and these are the ones that are still applicable today because they're based on God's character, which is never changing. So as you go through, it's helpful to distinguish, am I looking at a civil law? Am I looking at a ritual law? Am I looking at an ethical law? So we're not going to survey all of the laws. What we are going to do is take just the Ten Commandments. And like I said, in these ancient Near Eastern covenants, you had kind of these general stipulations and then broken down into more specific laws. And so in the covenant that God makes with his people, the general stipulations are the Ten Commandments. Okay? Now, we call them the 10 Commandments, but we should actually call them the 10 words. Because we look at 20 verse 1, it says, and God spoke all these words. That's the Hebrew word devar, and it isn't later translated as commandment. So it doesn't read, and God spoke all these commandments, right? These are the words that God is speaking to his people. Now notice, there's 10 words, okay? We shouldn't call them 10 commandments, but 10 sets of words. And now this has also appeared, this set of 10, earlier on in the narrative from Genesis up until this point. When God creates the world, he speaks 10 times. And so in that sense, the law is like God, again, creating his people anew by giving them this new law. The 10 plagues, right? That almost forms the opposite. If God created the world with 10 words, it's almost like he's destroyed or decreated the nation of Egypt, which we saw was the case. He destroyed them, and out of the death of that nation, he brought a new nation out, the nation of Israel. But then these 10 words of the 10 commandments, they're like the new way they're meant to live in this new world. Okay? And so let's go through them. The first one, beginning in verse 3, is, you shall have no other gods before me. Okay? This is a prohibition against idolatry, against worshiping other gods. The words there, before me, is like before my face. And one of my favorite Bible teachers, he talks about this, that it's like Israel and God are face to face, and you can't let anything else come in that intimate relationship to kind of take your attention away from Yahweh. And so commandment 1 has to do with worship of other gods. And again, this might seem not that challenging, but when you go into the land and the normal was to have as many gods as possible to make your life as secure as you can, to worship only one God was unheard of and would be seen as almost foolish. Well, what if that God isn't able to do this? You should also add this, right? And what if that God can't provide the rain in the season you need it? You should also worship this God just to be safe. Now, again, to apply that to our own life, that's easy, right? We worship God and trust God, but we're always looking for a plan B, right? Another way to make our lives more secure and more safe, instead of putting everything on the faithfulness of God, banking our whole lives on the reality that he is trustworthy. So just as challenging as it was for them to obey commandment 1, it's still a challenge for us to obey that when we see that we can only worship God and no other source of security or provision or identity. Now, the second commandment, oftentimes people see this as kind of a repetition of the first one, but it isn't. Okay? The first one is a prohibition against idolatry, worshiping other gods alongside of Yahweh. The second one is a prohibition of making images of Yahweh. And so if the first one says, don't worship other gods, the second one is, don't worship Yahweh like other nations worship their gods. And this is where he prohibits them from making any kind of image of a god to worship, right? Nothing from heaven, nothing from the earth, nothing from under the earth. So when Israel made the golden calf and worshipped it as a festival to the Lord, they weren't breaking the first commandment, right? They weren't worshiping some Egyptian god or some Canaanite god. They were worshiping Yahweh, so they were breaking the second commandment. Now, this is the reason we said this is because Israel cannot have the other nations think that Yahweh is somewhat comparable on the same level as the other gods. Now, the third commandment, do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Verse 7. I grew up hearing that this commandment is about swearing. You cannot swear. Now, of course, swearing is vulgar and shows issues with your character, but that's not primarily what this passage is talking about. One way, there's two ways you could interpret this. One way is in the context, God's talking about worship, okay? And so he's saying commandment 1 was don't worship other gods. Commandment 2 is don't worship me like you would other gods. And commandment 3 is don't have kind of those same worship practice where you just vainly repeat the name of the Lord again and again, some kind of cultural ritual. meaning if I just say his name enough, then he'll give me what I want. So it's actually a commandment about not manipulating God into doing what you want, because that's how every other religion in Canaan and in Egypt, that was the premise they built off of. We need to manipulate God to give us what he wants, us what we want, because the gods aren't really loving and they're not caring and they're not like a father. They're more evil and unpredictable. Another way to view this is later on in the Bible. One of the clearest parts is Jeremiah 13, verse 11. In Jeremiah 13, verse 11, God calls Israel my name. Now, if Israel, like your name is how you're known, right? How people know you, how they associate you. And so if God says my name is the people of Israel, again, that's what we saw with this idea of kingdom and priest. They're the representation of God. They're his name. They're how everyone else will know him. And so if they take that name in vain, meaning breaking commandments 1 and 2 of worshiping other gods or worshiping Yahweh like other gods, the name of God will be profaned. And that's what it says in Ezekiel 37, verse 22, is that they've profaned the name of God through idolatry worship of other gods. And then God then is left without a witness. And the nations look at Israel and think, well, they worship our gods, or our gods are like their gods. And so that's what Commandment 3 is more getting to. Commandment 4 is the Sabbath. Okay? Now this is interesting. There's not a single ancient Near Eastern parallel to this law. There's not a single other covenant that the God or the king commands his people to take a rest. Another interesting thing to note, in Exodus chapter 20, we have the 10 commandments, and then they're repeated again in Deuteronomy. And pretty much all of the commandments are word for word exactly the same, except for this one. What's different about them is twofold. One of them is in Exodus, they're meant to remember the Sabbath, and in Deuteronomy, they're meant to observe the Sabbath. Okay, so something there you could observe and interpret. The second major difference is the reason for it. So in verse 11 of chapter 20, the reason, that's the connector, right? The reason for keeping the Sabbath is that it's because creation. In 6 days, God created the world, and then the seventh day he rested. Therefore, you should keep it. So the reason for Sabbath remembrance in Exodus is creation, remembering that God created the world. Now in Deuteronomy, it's different, right? This is in Deuteronomy chapter 5. The reason, you can look for the connector word. If we go there in 5 verse, it begins in verse 12, but we see the connector is in verse 15, right? There's the therefore. What's the reason you're meant to keep the Sabbath in Deuteronomy? And the reason comes in the previous verse. It's because you shall remember you were a slave in Egypt, and God brought you out of Egypt. So it has nothing to do with creation or right? The words aren't used there. But according to what we've been saying, their rescue out of Egypt is like a new creation. It's like death to life, slave to son. And so in Exodus, he's saying, remember the Sabbath to remember God's creative action and his creative work. And then in Deuteronomy, it's remember the Sabbath because of his redeeming work or his recreating work. And very powerful. When we look in the New Testament, we see that Jesus is death, and what we're meant to remember is that he recreated us and he saved us. And so it's the start of the new creation. It's our deliverance from sin. And so the Sabbath is incredibly important. It's one of the only 10 commandments that isn't really applied today, and no one even really thinks of it, whereas the others are all very applicable. So it needs some interpretation given to that. But to put it simply, the Sabbath is meant to be kept in the Old Testament to remember God's creating work and his redeeming work. Now, this is where they shift. The first 4 commandments have to do with the vertical relationship with Yahweh, right? Don't worship other gods. Don't worship like other gods. Don't worship other gods. Don't worship the gods of the nations like you would worship Yahweh, and the Sabbath, okay? Now, the coming 6 have to do with your horizontal relationship, your relationship one to another. And these ones are rather straightforward. Honor your father and mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Don't lie in a court case, in accusation. And then lastly, you shall not covet. The interesting thing to note of these 6 commandments is all of them are negative actions you're not meant to do, except for the last one. The last one is a thought you're not allowed to think. Right? Do not covet. Do not want something that is not yours. Now, that's interesting, and some commentators would say that that last commandment, do not covet, actually is the reason you would break all the other covenants. You'd break all the other laws, vertical or horizontal relationships. You murder because you covet. You commit adultery because you covet. You steal because you covet. You lie against your neighbor because you covet. But it also takes the 10 Commandments and puts it on a heart level. And so we need to see the 10 Commandments as a good summary that this law is meant to be your vertical relationship with God, but also your horizontal relationship with God. And we know in the New Testament, when Jesus died on the cross, he was setting right our vertical relationship with God, but he was also setting right our horizontal relationship with one another. Now, these laws, these 10 Commandments, they actually summarize all of the other laws in the covenant that God makes with his people. And there's actually 613 laws. So in a sense, you summarize these 613 laws with these 10, right? And these 10 can be divided to your vertical, the first 4, and your horizontal relationship, the last 6. Then when Jesus was asked the greatest commandment, he summarizes the 10 commandments with 2. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. That's the vertical relationship. And love your neighbor as yourself. That's the horizontal relationship. And so the 10 commandments can be summarized by love God and love neighbor. And so this is how they're meant to live. If they follow the laws, which essentially are love God and love your neighbor, then they will look different. They will look set apart from the nations. They will act as this priestly nation. Now, let's just remind ourselves of the flow of the book where we're at. So far, we've had redemption, right? God redeeming them out of Egypt, and then he makes a covenant with them. And we'll see in the coming passages, after that covenant is made, then he wants to dwell with his people. And this is the same progression as we'll see again in the next session of our own lives. God redeems us from our sin, and then he offers us a covenant, an agreement with him. And so Jesus didn't just die for your own kind of personal and private relationship with him. Jesus died for your covenanted fellowship with him, right? Where you agree to live a certain way so that you can display him to the rest of the world. Now, there's one key vital part missing in this, and that's what comes after you agree to the covenant, and that's the topic of our next session.